Hi, Mike King, realnewsandhistory.com, and this is episode number 3 of the rise and fall of the New World Order Cabal. Make sure you watch all of the episodes in chronological order. There's a link below. Like this video, share this video, and follow me on Rumble. All right, let's get started with the story of the American Revolution. The real story of the American Revolution, not necessarily what we were taught growing up in elementary school and in high school. And the conventional story of the American Revolution, if you're an American, this is what you were taught. It's a little different in Britain, but this is what we grew up on. The big bad George III, the wicked tyrant who oppressed the American colonists with high taxes, and ultimately they rebelled against the British crown. It's not exactly how it happened. First of all, he was a constitutional monarch. We spoke in the last episode about the Glorious Revolution in England, and Oliver Cromwell and the Jewish financiers. They wanted to weaken the monarchy and establish a constitutional monarchy with a parliament. So it was like a power sharing agreement, really. So taxes were imposed by the British Parliament, not by the king. Okay. The prelude to the war, the American Revolution, would be the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. And there was always a controversy and incursions among the British colonists and the French in the West and the Indian tribes. So that's how it started, territorial disputes. The first shots were actually fired by George Washington. He led a small contingent of troops. He was sent as an emissary by the British, because they were British subjects back then, to tell the French stay out of this territory. And that's how the war started and expanded. And the early colonists generally supported the French and Indian War, which lasted for 7 years. At the end of the 7-year period, King George issued a proclamation in 1763. And what this does, or what it did, is it delineated the boundaries of the American colonies and the Western lands. So there was to be no further settlement by British colonists of anything west of the Appalachian Mountains. And some of the colonists who had already settled there on their own had to come back. And this was done mainly to keep the peace with some of the Indian tribes, not to encroach anymore in the land and avoid future wars. And this upset some of the colonists because they thought they were going to get Western lands, and now you have the king saying, "No, this is it. This is the boundary." So that was kind of the beginning of some of the contention between the colonies and the motherland. Also, the war incurred a high cost, and it required also after the war the British to station troops here in the colonies for the benefit and protection of the colonies. Otherwise, ultimately, the French would have encroached and maybe taken over the colonies. So the British felt we actually fought this war, at least partially, on your behalf, and we're providing the protection, so you colonists need to pay up a little bit. So the Stamp Act was passed. And this was an act of British Parliament. They had a prime minister, an elected parliament back then. It wasn't the king, but again, it's always, he's the lightning rod that people can point to as the tyrant. But this was the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act on printed materials, which included legal documents, newspapers, things like that. And they had such a tax in Britain anyway, and it was not a big tax. Okay. So paying for the stamp was the tax. And then the opposition grew to the Stamp Acts. The colonists, they published their own with a skull and crossbones. That was their propaganda response to the Stamp Act tax. What you have to realize is this was not a lot of money. This was chump change. But it was argued, you're passing taxes on us and we don't have representation in the British Parliament. You have no right to do this. This is what some of the colonists argued. And of course, the British point of view was we're providing all this protection, and our armies are there, and you're benefiting from this arrangement, and you're paying only a fraction of what British subjects in England pay. What's the big deal? So, in terms of money, it was not a lot of money at all. Um, so, really, what was driving the emerging rebellion to the Stamp Act was something more ideological. The idea that you can't tax us. We're independent colonies. We have our own arrangement here. We've never done this before. So, but there was not a huge public outcry against it. But there were agitators who were making it into something much bigger than it was, whether it was on the principle of the matter or they just wanted their own country. There was several motives at work here leading into the revolution. So, in response to the Stamp Act, and there were protests. Now, some of the tax collectors, they would tar and feather them in New England. New England was where the revolution was really based. That was the hotbed of it. And that is where the Sons of Liberty was formed. Sons of Liberty was a secret society, and they were very radical and militant anti-British. And some of America's key founders were members of the Sons of Liberty. Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. Samuel Adams, John Hancock, who signed the first signer of Declaration of Independence with the giant signature. Paul Revere, Christopher Gadsden, the Gadsden flag, the yellow flag with the snake, don't tread on me. That's that guy. So they were hardcore, and this was their symbol, their logo, red and white stripes, which ultimately became red and white stripes of the American flag. So they were very militant. They were violent. They were very violent, and they abused and attacked and tarred and feathered tax collectors, and they began the process of inciting other colonists to rebellion. Another one of their members was Haim Salomon, richest man in America, a moneylender, a Jewish moneylender, member of the Sons of Liberty, presumably their main funder. Later on, he funded the Continental Army. This guy was a moneybags here. Haim Salomon, Jewish financier. Here's a postage stamp honoring him, commemorating him. This stamp was issued in 1776 for the American bicentennial. Little known figure, but huge. Without his money, it's doubtful that the Americans could have continued the fight. And he was a member of the Sons of Liberty. So again, this is like an early indication. I don't want to say this was a cabal revolution, but there were elements embedded in the revolutionary movement that seemed to be tied to this thing. Freemasons, a lot of the founding fathers were Freemasons. And Freemasonry, although its members are not monolithic, generally speaking, they were anti-monarchy. Okay. So as a result of this opposition to the Stamp Act on the part of the colonists, the British relented and they repealed it the following year. 1776, the Stamp Act is repealed. And that image shows a tax collector, and this would be a colonist working for the British, being attacked, tarred, and feathered. And that's the Sons of Liberty were doing that. And then they would hang people in effigy who were British officials. So it was a very incendiary propagation and incitement by the Sons of Liberty, which would in due time spread. Okay. Let's see. They even burned the home of one of the tax collectors. The Sons of Liberty did. So after the Stamp Act was repealed, concurrently with that, the British Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, which stated that the Parliament does have the authority to tax the American colonists, just like they have the authority to tax the British colonists. But we have to, again, emphasize that the taxes that had been imposed by the Stamp Act and even the subsequent taxes were chump change compared to what they paid over in England, a fraction. Maybe amounted to about 1% of the total income of your average colonist. I mean, they didn't have an income tax, but I'm saying, with the if you add up the various fees that they assessed. And again, the British point of view is we have to have our military there to protect your frontiers, ante up a little bit. Totally reasonable, to be honest. I mean, you could say, well, in principle, there's no representation and they're imposing taxes. Okay, that's fine, but we need to dispel this myth that the taxes that were passed, the tax acts that were passed by the British Parliament, not the King, were onerous or oppressive or burdensome to people's lifestyle. They were not. They just weren't. So all that stuff you were told about colonists rebelling against excessive taxation, that's just mythology. I know some of you boomer patriots might not want to hear that, but that's the reality of it. I'm just trying to get at the truth here. There were legitimate opinions on both sides, but let's be honest here. The taxes were chump change. Okay, after that was repealed, Charles Townshend, he was the British Exchequer, the equivalent of Secretary of the Treasury, passed the Townshend Acts, which taxed various items, most notably the tea, placed the tax on tea. And again, this was just a fraction of a percent, tiny. And the Sons of Liberty went to work right away, resuming the protests and the incitement. And, this just continued year after year, but the British never really responded. The last thing they wanted to do was give an excuse for the rebellion to intensify, because most colonists were still loyal to the crown. I mean, it's generally said that it's about a third, and a third. I mean, there's no polling data from that era, but it seems about right. That a third of the colonists wanted to remain loyal to the British crown, and a third were supporting the rebellion, or ultimately did support the rebellion. And then you had another category, your fence sitters, who kind of really didn't care, could go either way. So this was not a widespread uprising that was brewing. It was still something that needed to be nurtured like a fire. And that's what the Sons of Liberty were doing. Now, here's where the revolution, I mean, there hasn't been any fighting or shooting at this point, but you could call it the pre-revolution, I guess, the pre-revolutionary war. Here's where it really heats up. In March of 1770, we all learned about the Boston Massacre. Troops went into Boston Commons, broke up a protest, firing into the crowd, and killed 5 Bostonians. And this really inflamed not only the New England area, but now it started to spread more to the south and into the central states and the southern colonies, because the event was misrepresented. The Sons of Liberty orchestrated this thing. They incited it, and then they used the British response as atrocity propaganda. Like this. Here's 5 coffins with the initials of the 5 men killed that day, the martyrs. One on the death of the 5 young men who were murdered on March 5th by the 29th Regiment. The reality is the Sons of Liberty turned out this mob. It's sort of like the equivalent of today's color revolutions. They got this mob out there and they incited them, and they started trouble with the British troops, with one in particular, and then he called for backup. And before you knew it, hundreds of colonists, and many of them Sons of Liberty members, others incited by the Sons of Liberty, were surrounding these British troops and throwing bricks at them, throwing ice balls at them, and shouting. It is said at the trial that somebody was shouting, "Fire, fire." So evidently they wanted the British troops to fire so they could have some blood and have that propaganda event to really incite the colonies. And that's what happened. And the troops were arrested and tried for murder, and they were acquitted. because the reality was they were surrounded, and there were people that testified on their behalf. So these guys were really scared, and they were being harassed and abused. And one guy fired, and the rest fired, and that's the true story of the Boston Massacre. But that's not what was publicized, and that event really started the revolution. Now, I've got a quote here from John Adams, who, incidentally, second president of the United States, founding father. Incidentally, he defended those British troops at their trial. I think 3 were acquitted, 2 were found guilty of manslaughter, but their only punishment is their palm was branded with an M. Okay, but nonetheless, the British were outraged by that. You started this, and now you're going to put our troops on trial for murder. So this really upped the ante, the escalation. But John Adams later observed, on that night, he's talking about the Boston Massacre, the foundation of American independence was laid. Not the Battle of Lexington nor the surrender of Burgoyne or Cornwallis were more important events in American history than was the Battle of King Street on the 5th of March, 1770. It happened at King Street. The following year, actually 2 years later, there's another event happened. This one is not as well publicized, but it's also a Sons of Liberty deal. It's called the Gaspee Affair. A British vessel chasing smugglers ran aground in Rhode Island, and a group of colonists led by the Sons of Liberty attacked the ship and burnt it to the shoreline. It was called the HMS Gaspee. And yet the British did not respond with force. I mean, it's actually quite remarkable how much forbearance King George III showed towards this brewing rebellion. Later on, when it came time to suppress it, okay, the British came in with a heavy hand. But you have to look at the context of this thing, because any government would do that. Any president, any prime minister, any king, when faced with a rebellion like that, sooner or later they're going to play hardball. Whether you believe it's justified or not, that's the way it is. And so you can hardly portray King George as a tyrant, like we were taught. So now you had this tax on tea. Again, it was chump change. But in 1773, the Sons of Liberty in Boston, they raided a British ship and they dumped 350 pounds, or chests, very large chests full of tea in the harbor. As in today's dollars, is probably the equivalent of several $1 million worth of tea. They just destroyed it. And I mean, now it's getting to the point where the British either they have to save face or they have to respond. They can't just allow this to go. I mean, this is thuggery. Sons of Liberties were more like sons of bitches. Truth be known. One could argue, well, it was for a good cause, but I mean, that's fine. You make that judgment, but they use deceptive and violent means in order to induce the British into making a response, and so then they can incite the public. It's very similar to what FDR did with Pearl Harbor. We'll cover that in a later episode. Provoke, provoke, provoke. You get the response, and then you can point at your adversary as evil, and now everybody supports you. And that's what happened after the Boston Massacre, by the way. There was support for the Patriot movement skyrocketed because of the misinformation. But in response to the Tea Party, now the British passed a series of acts that were dubbed by colonial propagandists as the intolerable acts. They really weren't that intolerable. Well, one, they put a blockade on the Boston Harbor, and they said, you have to pay for that tea you destroyed. Okay, they had to respond to that. You can't just let something like that pass. They established tighter governmental control over Massachusetts because this is where the rebellion was really brewing. There was the Administration of Justice Act, which meant that you can't try British citizens or British soldiers anymore like you did after the Boston Massacre. We'll put them on trial. And there was the Quartering Act, uh, which many people misunderstand as it were requiring colonists to house British troops in their homes. No, it meant you have to provide quarters for them because they're there to protect your frontiers. That was the argument. So you have whether it's in the form of building barracks for them or abandoned buildings or inns or something like that. So these were not all that intolerable, quote unquote, but again, it fed the propaganda. So things are just getting worse with this revolutionary fervor. The British now send troops to Massachusetts for the purpose of gathering up the arms of the Sons of Liberty and various other rebels, and specifically arrest John Hancock and Paul Revere. And when the colonists get word of this, they ambush the British troops. That's the Battle of Lexington and Concord, 1775. So now blood has been shed. There's no way to avert what's coming. So that's how the revolution really got started. There was no heavy British oppression. It was just an idea that the colonies, or at least in Massachusetts, that the colonies ought to be independent. And to get this movement going, we're going to incite and provoke the British as much as possible, so they can make the first, the first move at the Boston Massacre or something like that. And then the Lexington and Concord. That was also a provocation. They engineered the situation in such a manner that the British had to come in and start arresting these Sons of Liberty. I won't get into like the battles and the flow of the war. You can read those accounts in your conventional history books. I'm trying to deal here more with the political, philosophical aspects and the chess players moving the pieces on the board. During the war, July 4th, 1776, Thomas Jefferson, they published and they signed the Declaration of Independence, which is why we celebrate 4th of July. The war hasn't been won yet, but this is like during the war. And what the Declaration of Independence does, it sets forth some philosophical principles. All men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, etc. But mainly, it recites a litany of grievances against King George III. And again, he's not. It's more the Parliament makes these policies, but the king was an easy target. So if you read the Declaration of Independence, it's the king did this, the king did that, the king did the other thing. Really makes him sound like a brutal tyrant. And it's not that the Jefferson's assertions are false. It's actually true, but the missing chronological context is how this was incited and how he was pushed to this, and how for years the British tried to pacify the colonies. Okay? So, and Jefferson himself and many of the other founders were influenced by Enlightenment philosophers. Uh, they read them. They're very influential on the thinking of the founding fathers. Many of them, especially John Locke. This guy here, English philosopher of the 1600s. Anti-monarchy. He actually had to flee. Remember in the last episode we talked about King Charles I was beheaded on orders of Oliver Cromwell. Later on, King Charles II, when the Stuarts regained the crown, he's poisoned and killed. And then the brother of King Charles, James, is forced to flee during the Glorious Revolution. That's all in episode 2. But prior to Charles II being evidently poisoned, there was an assassination plot to kill Charles II and his brother James. It's called the Rye House Plot. And as a result of which, John Locke had to flee Britain for this plot to murder this pro-Catholic absolute monarch, Charles, and his brother James. And he fled to Holland. And that's where the Glorious Revolution later came. The troops invaded, and King James fled. and that was the not only the end of the Catholic dynasty, but it was also the end of an authoritarian monarchy. At that point, British became a constitutional monarchy with a parliament. But that's John Locke's deal. So he's very radical, willing to kill kings. And a lot of founders were influenced by his writings, even though it was a century later. And more contemporary would be Jean Jacques Rousseau, a Frenchman. So he's another one who's influential in thinking of the founders. And basically, you had two. The old way, the old school philosophy was an absolute monarch and hereditary aristocracy, with the monarch being bound by the divine law. So the monarch is he's put there by God essentially to govern, but he has to obey the divine law himself. That's hereditary monarchy. But what John Locke and Rousseau and many of the early founders believed is we don't want monarchy. That's an antiquated relic. We want a republican, democratic form of government, power to the people. The people are good. They can govern themselves. So it's a conflict of philosophical visions. So I would say that conflict, that philosophical conflict, plus the fact that many of the colonists just felt, we're over here, they're over there. Let's just be independent and build our own country. So there's a philosophical motive and a practical motive that served as the basis for the revolution. It was not resistance to tyranny. There was no real tyranny. So, but even then, and even during the war itself, there are many people that remain loyalists. And we talked about those three factions. We're talking about in the colonies. You had your patriots and loyalists who remained loyal to the British. And they would suffer during the war. They were treated very badly. Some of them were tarred and feathered. Some of them were forced to flee to Canada. Sons of Liberty did a number on them, too. And then in the middle, and this is probably the largest element, was your fence sitters. They could go either way. They didn't really care. One day they'd hear a patriot argument. The next day they would hear a loyalist argument. But if you put the loyalists and the fence sitters together, they vastly outnumber the colonists who supported the revolution. And of those colonists who did support the revolution, how many did so only because of atrocity propaganda? So really, it was a very, very small, close-knit band of men, Sons of Liberty, Freemasons, many of them wealthy and in high positions, that had this vision of breaking away and forming a republic independent of Britain. But that's not you're not gonna meet your numbers at the recruitment office selling philosophy, right? But you can get people incited by talking about liberty and tyranny and massacres, etc. So it was sort of like some dishonest means were used to promote what you might consider a noble cause, or maybe you don't. I think there's arguments for and against hereditary monarchy, as well as against a Republican democratic form of government. But my point here is to clear up the misconceptions and show how, even though I would not say the Cabal engineered this, they were there. Their presence was felt through the Freemasons, somewhat through the Sons of Liberty, and certainly through a character like Chaim Solomon, the Jew financier who financed the whole thing. Later that year, Christmas 1776, Washington crosses the Delaware River, surprises the British and their Hessian German mercenaries at Trenton. And this was the first victory of the colonists, of the Continental Army. So that really, what that did is it really emboldened the French to enter the war overtly. I should mention, prior to that, they were helping the colonists because they always had that thing with Britain. But now, it was after that victory that the French decided ultimately, okay, they got a shot at winning. Let's join and give them the advantage, and that is ultimately what won the war. It wasn't a ragtag group of militiamen. That's another fiction or fantasy. First of all, the Continental Army was trained by Washington, and European officers was professional army financed by Chaim Solomon, um, and they weren't just ragtag Minutemen. But more importantly, they were joined by the French, who was a superpower at that time, and that turned the tide of the war, and also Spain and the Netherlands, because all these European countries would be rivals against each other, particularly Britain. They provided assistance, and they discouraged the British from imposing a successful naval blockade, particularly in the South. Because that's the last thing the British needed now to beat a war with France, with Spain, and with Holland. So there was an enormous assist from other countries helping the cause of the Patriots, without which there'd be no chance of winning. So that's February 1778. France officially enters the war militarily. And by 1781, Britain has had enough. The whole war is just a liability. And there were people in Britain, even from the beginning, saying, just let them go. If they want to be independent, let them be independent. And then the argument was, well, we allow that, we'll lose the whole empire. All we ask for is a little bit of taxes. So you even had that contentious debate in Britain. You had that divide, just like you had over here. So the lines were not clearly drawn. But ultimately, the British surrender at Yorktown. This is after a series of defeats to George Washington and also the French. And this begins the process of negotiation for peace. The new nation is formed, and from 1781 to 1788, the 13 colonies became the 13 states. They function under what's known as the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. Okay. In essence, that was the first constitution of the United States. After those years, it was deemed that it's too weak of a union under the Articles of Confederation. We need limited government, but we need something a little stronger. And thus, they drafted and passed the United States Constitution. And there's the famous painting, the 1788 Constitutional Convention, chaired by George Washington. And they selected George Washington to be the first president of the United States. And they established the Constitution with the separation of powers and the election of congressmen. Senators were elected by state legislatures, and it was all a Supreme Court. So you had an elaborate system of checks and balances. This was the counter philosophy to the idea of the divine right of kings and an absolute monarch, or even a constitutional monarchy. So that's what it was all about, was the philosophical difference, as well as the British being so far away. We just want our own country now. And but there was that element from the very beginning, working through the Freemasons, and trying to get control of a new country and then expand it and dominate it. They had their agents already in the country. People like Alexander Hamilton. We'll talk about him in the next episode. But I want to close by again showing you the back of a dollar bill, which contains the front and the back of the seal of the United States, which was finalized in 1788, that same year at the Constitutional Convention. And the designer of the seal was Charles Thompson, member of the Sons of Liberty, and also a Freemason. And you see the Freemason symbolism here, unmistakable. The pyramid with the all-seeing eyeball at the top, illuminated eyeball. The Latin inscription, "He has blessed our undertaking," and "Novus Ordo Seclorum," new order for the ages. And then there's the eagle. The stars above the eagle are configured in such a way it forms a Star of David. Many speculate that's a shout out to Chaim Solomon. Could be. He financed the thing. And then the shield has the red and white stripes of the Sons of Liberty. So there's a big Masonic element to the American Revolution. And again, the Freemasons were not monolithic. They're not necessarily evil. But it was through the Freemasons that these nefarious cabal agents and their Illuminati, which we're going to talk about in the next episode, they would do their dirty work through the Freemasons. So that's the true story of the American Revolution. And in our next episode, we'll talk about the early years and the first controversy over central banking and the Illuminati. Okay, so that will be episode 4. If you missed the earlier ones, I've got the link below to a master page that has all of the episodes in chronological historical order. So please check that out. Share this video. Let's make this series go viral. And also, if you like these videos, please support my work. Even donation as little as $5 helps coming from all of you. All the pertinent links are down below. So that's all I got, and I'll see you soon. Thank you.